Well, on to now another story that we have been watching very closely, especially this evening. It's the concerns of a new arms race. Now, after the American president, Donald Trump, held firm in his State of the Union address and defended his decision to pull America out of a missile pact with Russia, the INF treaty signed back in 1987. Now, this banned both countries from developing short and medium-term missiles, and Russia hit back. They announced that they have their own plans to develop a new missile system. Let's take a look at this.
Well, we followed the agreement and the rules to the letter. Russia repeatedly violated its terms. It's been going on for many years. That is why I announced that the United States is officially withdrawing from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty.
Который хорошо зарекомендовал себя в Сирии. В эти же сроки нам предстоит создать наземный ракетный комплекс с гиперзвуковой ракетой большой дальности.
All right, joining me to discuss this, we have Yana Tom. She's Estonian MEP on the Russian delegation from the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats. We also have Tomas Zedovsky, a Czech MEP from the EPP group. And we still have Darren McCaffrey, our political editor. All right, I want to talk about, first of all, why Trump said what he said. So he finally said, OK, we're leaving the INF. What do you think is really behind him leaving this treaty?
Of course, he said truth, but I believe it's only partly truth. But nobody is speaking about China. He tweeted about China, that Russia's doing it, China is doing it, and we are kind of in the city, so we're going to do the same.
I mean, that's interesting. We will indeed be getting more into China there, but what he said also is that this is against, well, not just China, but also Russia. And now Russia is saying, well, we're going to develop our own missiles. How dangerous is this getting?
Yes, China and Russia are cooperating together. Last many years, 8 years.
You think they are cooperating together?
They are cooperating together in many issues. And this is why really Donald Trump was tweeting about that, because it's not only about Russia. I think that next agreement, INF agreement, will be the one of part of this agreement must to be the China too. Also, it's very important to understand the situation. This is not only about the Russia. It's globally about this cooperation between two countries, China and Russia.
But Chinese already said that they're not interested in it. They said it in the end of last year.
Sure. And
I think in many ways, you know, actually Donald Trump might be right on this aspect, in the sense that we believe Russia's been in contravention of this treaty anyway for, well, back as early as 2014. And the evidence to which to prove that's been getting increasingly difficult. And second of all, clearly there is now not just two global superpowers, but there is increasingly a third one. And on that case, you know, when these treaties were drawn up, China was not a global superpower. It clearly is now becoming one and wants to become a military one, potentially. So, you know, resetting, essentially, the debate on this is probably not necessarily a bad thing.
All right, and we also had NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg commenting on this today, and this is what he had to say.
So we don't want a new arms race, and therefore what we will do is partly to try to convince Russia to come back into compliance with the treaty. There will be a 6 months period until the withdrawal process is finalized, and in that period Russia can come back. So we still have 6 months.
All right, for more on this, for more analysis, that is, I'm joined by Alexander Vershbow. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Russia and Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2012 to 2016. He's joining me from Washington. It's very good to see you there. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now, you have been Deputy Secretary of NATO. You have been a U.S. ambassador to Russia. You've seen it from the inside. What is your reading of exactly what is going on here?
Well, I have been involved in this issue for a long time, actually back to the 70s. So it's a personal issue for me. But it's also a fact that Russia has violated what was one of the landmark treaties of the Cold War, which really, for the first time, eliminated a whole class of missiles and really changed the whole psychology of the arms race. Now we're going back, unfortunately, because of Russia's violation, to a potentially unconstrained world. And I think that NATO, of course, is threatened by these new Russian missiles. And if the Russians deploy these additional ones that the defense minister was talking about, which they're well placed to do, there could be a new imbalance in Europe that NATO will have to address. But I don't think we're yet at the moment to panic. There is, as the Secretary General just said in that clip, 6 months where the Russians might come back to the table. President Trump left the door open to, if not this agreement, then a different agreement which might address the China dimension in some way. I'm not optimistic about that, but at least there's a chance that diplomacy could prevent the worst case, which is an unconstrained arms race in Europe.
Mr. Vershbow, I mean, even looking at, yes, the words of Donald Trump has been tough on Russia in terms of nuclear weapons, of missiles, but do you not think that Trump and Vladimir Putin, they do have some sort of an amicable relationship behind the scenes? I mean, is there something more to this than what we see on the surface?
Well, I don't think there's any kind of secret understanding between the two. I think, on the contrary, they share perhaps a concern about the Chinese threat. Putin's been talking about getting out of this treaty or modifying it for over 10 years. So it's not a surprise that Russia is kind of seizing on the opening created by the U.S. decision to withdraw to announce kind of new programs and new potential deployments, which may be in Asia as well as in Europe. But I think that in this case, the president is showing the appropriate firmness. It may be a little scary when he said in his State of the Union address that we're going to outspend and out-innovate the Russians. But they should think twice about this. Russia is a small economy. It really can't afford this aggressive arms buildup that it's been carrying out in recent years. Okay. And maybe, if not rescuing this treaty, at least negotiating a new one which puts a cap on these kinds of systems, maybe permits only conventionally armed versions in Europe and continues to ban nuclear armed versions. That might be a better outcome. You
were saying earlier that now is not the time to panic yet, but when the time does come, when is that point where you say, okay, this is actually a real threat, and how big of a threat will that be for Europe?
Well, the treaty will be officially defunct in 6 months if nothing happens to revive diplomacy. So that's a moment to get real nervous. I don't know about panic. It depends a lot on whether the Russians actually move ahead with the deployment of some of these new wonder weapons that the defense minister talked about. Putin, in his comments with the defense minister on the weekend, said he won't deploy the new systems unless the United States does. And I think the U.S. is going to move deliberately with NATO to try to come up with a common approach. And so far, the U.S. is emphasizing conventional responses, not nuclear ones. So we may be able to avoid a nuclear arms race, but still, these new technologies, hypersonic weapons that the Russians keep talking about, all of this creates for a much more unpredictable situation, which is already very unstable since the Russians' invasion of Crimea 5 years ago.
All right, thank you for that. Alexander Vershbow talking to us there from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. All right, so the threat to Europe, Jens Stoltenberg also was saying was more calm about it. Do you agree with this assessment with Mr. Vershbow and Jens Stoltenberg that, okay, wait a minute, let's not panic. This is not a big deal?
I think now is the very big space for some negotiation, diplomatic work, and I think that Germans started this work very well. They started; it was not successful, but they are now asking for another meeting around the round table with Russia in March, and I think that we don't need to be in panic, but we have to be maximum clear that we want any agreement about that.
And what about the perspective from Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia? Is there a greater fear because you're in the Russian sphere?
We're not in Russian sphere. We're a member of the European Union and NATO.
No, I mean historically.
Yes,
I'm talking about.
Of course, for Europe as such, it's not a very good situation, and I believe that there is a point to be nervous. But if we're speaking about service and what is going on, you never know. Maybe they met in Helsinki. I met Putin and Trump. They met together. They were alone in the room. Maybe they have some kind of deal just to withdraw from agreement and to convince China to join it. You never know. And another thing is that in paradoxical way, both countries are benefiting from that. It sounds very cynical, but they both have big military production, which means jobs, which means economic growth, and so on and so forth. And Europe is in most vulnerable position in this situation.
And you keep mentioning China. You keep mentioning China. Is China really the actual threat here that we have not talked about enough?
Yeah, I think to a degree it has. And obviously, Cold War relations and these treaties are focused on the US-Russia divide rather than necessarily, as we said, this growing superpower. But it is interesting bringing up Trump and Putin's relationship, which actually ultimately could be the key to all of this. And you're right. I mean, they have been meeting often at those G7 or G20 meetings on the side with no one else there. Apart from translators, which with no notes taken, and we don't really know what they're talking about. But I think ultimately, if there is going to be a deal, it'll have to be very much in terms of the personal relationship at the moment between President Putin and President Trump.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll end that there because we have a lot more coming up on the program. Germany and France get rejected. We'll dive into why the European Commission is blocking two multi-billion euro rail companies from merging. Plus, should EU election candidates sign a pledge to combat sexual harassment? We'll debate a new initiative inspired by the Me Too movement. That's coming up next.